Hello dear viewers, support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it, and also make sure you comment your thought. Now let's start the video. Targaryen. He didn't sleep that well that night. Although the room he had been assigned was warm and indeed snug, after so many hundreds of years by the wall, the Night's Watch had obviously learnt how to build buildings that were damn warm. He kept coming awake, convinced that he could hear the wind howling in his ear. By the time that morning came, he'd finally been able to fall asleep, albeit a sleep that was punctuated by some damn odd dreams. He was running through a dark tunnel in one, a tunnel that echoed oddly, with something in his hand, and he needed to run faster, run harder. He was needed and there was something ahead that he needed to fight. In another dream, he was looking up at a huge heart tree as the branches reached down and beat back something just outside his line of sight. So when he emerged from his room and walked down the corridor with his bag, he was bleary-eyed and rubbing a hand over his chin. Should he shave or not? Perhaps not. A beard might be a good idea up here. Something to keep the wind away. Not too large a beard, though. Some of the men up here had ones that you could lose a spoon or three in. As he reached the courtyard, he saw that his horse had been saddled by young Pod. The lad had been a good find. Dutiful, if a bit naive. He was taking him with him to the night fort. The others were starting to assemble as he arrived. Robb Stark and his brother were busy yawning, but not as much as their direwolves. So was the Greyjoy boy. The latter still puzzled him more than a bit. Balon Greyjoy was an idiot obsessed by his wet god and who could always be relied upon to do the wrong thing. His last surviving son was, well, sometimes he was impulsive, only to pause and then visibly think things through before acting more thoughtfully. His direwolf was yawning a lot as well. As for the men of the Night's Watch, Alliser Thorne always looked as if he had bitten on a lemon. A harsh and bitter man, that one. A former Targaryen loyalist who had been given the choice of the Night's Watch or the Executioner's axe. He had two men with him, both of who looked as if they had fallen off the wall a few times. Well, perhaps not from the very top. And they were all glowering at the last 5 members of the party. Mance Rayder was a very interesting fellow indeed. He'd talked to the fellow briefly the previous night. The man was intelligent, surprisingly well-read and very charismatic. It was no wonder that he had become king beyond the wall. As for his companions, he blinked. One was a very intimidating fellow, very red of hair and beard, with a glower that the Greyton would envy. He was dressed in furs and had a knife strapped to his belt, a sword at his side and an axe at his back. The next was a younger man with black hair and tired eyes. But it was the other two who caught his eye. They were both women. One was slim, had bright red hair, a round face, small hands, a pug nose, crooked white teeth, and blue-gray eyes. There was something intense about her, as if her spirit was as fiery as her hair. She had a bow and a quiver, and she seemed to know how to use them. The other was hooded, with honey-colored hair peeking out. She had a sword, a dagger, and a look of not suffering fools, gladly. Mance Rayder caught his appraising glance and smiled slightly. Ye read it, and Vale, one can loose an arrow into your eye from a surprisingly large distance. The other can carve your balls off so fast that you'll not notice until they're rolling on the ground in front of you. Don't think that they're weak just because they're women. Others have made that mistake. They didn't like the results. There was a cough behind them, and he turned to see Lord Stark watching them. He seemed to be sending a look of carefully hidden amusement at Rayder. "Well now, Lord Targaryen," he said almost formally, "ready to visit the night fort?" He thought about it for a long moment. "No," he said with a smile. "But I have to go, don't I? After all, my Greenseer ancestor said I had to go." The wildlings stirred a little at this, with the red-headed girl mouthing Greenseer almost under her breath. "Aye," Lord Stark said. "You do have to go. Good fortune go with you. I have to talk to the Lord Commander here, a lot more. There's things that must be arranged." And then he strode over to his sons and his ward, talking to them in a low voice, and placing a hand on each other's shoulders in turn. They all smiled and nodded at his words, and Tyrion once again felt that pang of envy that his own father would never do such a thing. Lord Stark talked to Jon Stark last of all. Tyrion heard just 3 words of it. "Aemon told me," followed by a glance at his sword. Which was interesting because Jon Stark bore a sword with a new pommel, in the shape of a wolf. It seemed to be of a slightly different length as well. Was it new? But after that it was all business. Horses were mounted, in the case of some of the wildlings, slightly awkwardly. Pod appeared out of nowhere with his own horse, and a set of clothes that showed that he knew what the weather could be like up here, and then they rode out, heading west. The road had been repaired recently, and looked as if it had seen quite a bit of traffic. Trees had been felled from the vicinity of the road, and here and there he could see the odd place where rock outcrops had been mined for stone. They met parties as well, groups of volunteers in places, leavened with a few members of the Night's Watch. They had wagons of supplies, wood, stone, hay, all the things needed to repair walls and other buildings, to make them warm and snug. Some hard riding saw them at Queen's Gate within a few hours. The castle there seemed to be one giant building site, with the roof of the main hall there being retiled carefully. The gate through the wall was open there as well, and Tyrion watched in awe as a party of giants led their mammoths through it, all with great bundles of furs and other possessions on their backs. One trio passed right in front of their party, and he gaped up at the huge creatures as they strode south, hair blowing in the wind as they laughed and shouted at each other. "They're speaking something," Sir Thorne asked, as he stared at the passing giants. "The language of the first men, Saraleaser," Tyrion replied in odd tones. "They're saying how good the foraging will be here for their mammoths, about how lush the grass will be to the south." "You speak the language of the first men?"
"I do."
"One of many I speak," Thorne grunted in response, before looking at the wildlings that followed the giants. There was a conflicted look to his eyes, that eventually faded into a weary look of acceptance. "You didn't approve of this originally, did you?" Tyrion asked quietly as they trotted onwards. "No," Thorne replied, "but it has to be done. I know that, I don't like it, but it has to be done." They paused for luncheon, or what might be described as luncheon, just about within sight of Deep Lake. Again the castle was under repair, if a little less obviously than Queen's Gate. "We're repairing the ones east of Castle Black faster than the others west of it," Thorne explains quietly as they eat some of the stew that the men of the Night's Watch seem to know how to make so expertly. "The Shadow Tower's been sending its men east, and East Watch by the Sea's been sending its men west. Eventually we'll all meet up." Tyrion looked at Deep Lake and at the lake nearby. A beautiful place. "Aye," said Raider. "I used to tickle trout in the river there once. A long time ago." Thorne looked at his former brother, and Tyrion could see the anger that the man was hiding so poorly. "A very long time ago," Thorne spat bitterly, and then walked away. Raider sighed and shook his head. "That one bears grudges. He always has, and he always will." "How far from here to the Night Fort?" Tyrion asked the question in a bid to change the subject. 7 miles. We can be there in a few hours. Unless you're in a rush." He shuddered slightly. "No. Are you?" A shrug. "I should be. A child of the forest told me to go there." It was fortunate that Tyrion had not been drinking anything when he heard those words, as otherwise he would spat it all out. As it was, he paused and then stared at Raider. "I'm sorry. What was that?" "Did the old bear not tell you? A dying child of the forest was brought to us by a group of giants. Said that he, or she, buggered if I know which it was, had seen me in torment in a vision at the Night Fort. Said we had to go there with a man with a golden mind, and a boy who died and fell through time. All very mysterious." He peered at him. "You're a Lannister. I should have thought that the golden part fitted you well." Tyrion tilted his head slightly, in thought. "I would hope so. I'm not a boy, and I haven't died, let alone fallen through time. How very interesting. Not to mention painful. I wonder what it all means." "I don't know," said Raider as he finished off what remained of his stew, "and that bloody well worries me." Then he looked at him again. "What was that about a Greenseer ancestor?" "A former Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, Tyrek Lannister. He left me a letter. Do you know what it feels like to have the hairs on the back of your neck lift up so much that you think that they're going to tear off? I've talked to a child of the forest." "So you're asking that question to the wrong man," Raider grinned, and then he wandered off. Asha. It was the waiting. She hated. There was nothing she could do really, now that all the orders had been given and the men assigned to their places. At least her crew had stayed loyal to her. "You've led us this far," her bosun had said, speaking for the rest of them. "Lead us on." So now she was pacing about in a small depression on a hill overlooking the harbor. "Stop it," said a voice to one side. "You need to calm down." She stopped pacing and looked at her uncle. How can you be so calm? He opened an eye and squinted at her from his position on the boulder to one side. He'd been sitting there for more than 10 minutes now, despite the fact that he was wearing plate armor. She'd thought at first that he'd been asleep. I'm not calm, Uncle Roderick told her quietly. But I need to look calm, you know how important that is. But you're used to looking calm at sea, preparing for a crisis there. This is land, our land, my island. These men, I and these women, need me to give orders. Calmly, quietly, like the reader always does. I want to pace. I can't. Hear that noise? It's young Reynard. A good lad, but he always throws up before a battle. If I show that I'm nervous, then I'll make he and others nervous. So, I rest my eyes. Asha looked at him for a long moment and then chuckled softly and sat on a nearby rock and thought about the plan carefully. We're taking a risk, she said, eventually, in a soft voice. What if we're wrong? Your father has sent Victorian. You know what your uncle is like. He's a fighter, not a thinker. He can see a certain distance, but no further, and he's going to be looking to get what he views as his ships back, before trying to kill everyone on this island. So he'll come here. Not the harbor, the cove. The harbor's too well defended. Too many towers. There's the great chain boom. Too much risk of damaging both sets of his ships. He'll come here. There was a long pause as she thought it through, considering it from all angles. You're likely right, but it's the word likely that gnaws at my mind like a seagull at a stranded oyster. What as he strikes at the other end of the island in a feint? He won't. He'll come at us here. He knows of this place. She nodded slowly, and then just sat there. The sun was occasionally hidden by scudding clouds, and every now and then, she sniffed at the wind. Winds set fair from the west now. Yes. A pause. He'll come soon. High tide soon. As you planned for, hoped for, counted on. Low tide means farther to run. High tide means they can get close, inshore with the big ships of the Iron Fleet. She nodded. And then she stopped and looked out to sea, trying to do what her Uncle Roderick was doing, trying to look calm. But then she heard the sound of a galloping horse, and after a moment, a man came into sight on a blowing little horse. My lord, word from the lookout. The enemy has been sighted. Lord Harlaw nodded curtly and then stood up, before reaching out and picking up his helm. It seemed different, and she squinted at it. Ah, it had an eagle on the faceplate. Her uncle saw her look and smiled slightly. It seemed fitting, he muttered, before loosening his sword a little in its sheath and picking up his shield. Always liked watching sea eagles. She smiled, hefted her own shield, picked up her plainer helmet, and then joined him in walking down the track that led to the cove. As they went, they both exchanged words with the men waiting at the sides of the track, all dressed in armor and carrying spears and shields. The blacksmiths and armorers had been working at all hours the past days. But the real weapons were the other ones, and she winced a little at the thought. By the time that they arrived at the cove, they could see the line of longboats on the horizon. They had their sails furled, the wind was set wrong to use them, and the oars were being used, long sweeps driving the boats into the bay. What's the count? Asha called up to one of the men who were climbing up the cliffs to one side with bows slung at their backs. The man squinted at the horizon. About 40 of them, Captain. Aye. And it's the Iron Fleet. Seen them before. She sighed. Well, she'd known that it was coming. That said, the knowledge didn't make it any better. Her uncle paced from side to side issuing orders, settling any disputes between men who disagreed with each other and generally setting an example. And then he led her to one side, to a small rise that overlooked the cove. They're coming straight for us. Not the harbor, then. As I said, Victorian can see a certain distance, but no further. And he'll have his best men with him. He sighed. Of all your father's brothers, I always liked him the best. Not a clever man, but not a cruel one. By his standards, at least. A direct man. Not an idiot like Balin or insane like Damfair or whatever twisted thing Euron is. Asha found herself nodding. Aye, that covered her father and his brothers quite well. She looked up at the headland above them. Fires are lit. Good. Everyone has their orders. The timing is important. We have to make sure that they're committed. He paused. Normally I'd pray to the drowned god for success. Who should I pray to today? She paused, and then she shook her head. What to say? Pray to the seven? Surely not. Pray to some trees. Too strange. Pray to live, nuncle. Pray to live. Aye. And all they could then do was wait. Wait as the incoming ships came closer and closer. Wait as the drumming on the ships to keep the rowers in unison on the ships grew into a boom 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 that echoed off the cliffs. I see Victarion, Nuncle Roderick muttered quietly. Kraken helm and all, he placed his own helm on his head, but kept the faceplate raised as he dealt with the buckle. When the ships came spreading out a little, boom 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 went the drums. Louder, and then her uncle drew his sword. Spears and shields, spears and shields. There was a rumble and a clatter as the men ran down the track and then formed a shield wall, spears upright, just enough men, just enough to look like a panicked detachment from the harbor. The reserves were hidden further up. The drums kept booming, kept coming, and then Asha hissed, as first one and then two, and then three ships seemed to shudder and all but stop, the oars flailing in chaos. The masts waved with the shock, and in one case a man fell out of the crow's nest. 4 ships, no, 5, 6, and 7. Screams could be heard, and the first of the long ships to stop had a list already. She parted her lips in a snarl. Days before, at low tide, they'd hammered wooden A-frames into the sand and mud, supporting long pointed spars with iron tips specially wrought for them, all pointing out to sea. And ship after ship were impaled on them. Not every ship, though. For every one that stopped and shuddered, 2 more slipped through, with men at the prows and screaming directions for the helmsman. 1 in the 3, just 1 in 3, she lamented. I wanted half of them. We take what we can get. He uncle chided her. Get that helm on. Victarion's coming. She looked and swore slightly. Yes, her other uncle was pacing about on the prow of his ship, waving his arms and shouting, Now? Not yet. A little longer. The first ships of the Iron Fleet reached the shingle as their oars drove them on shore. And then the first men started leaping off the ships and into the surf, running up the beach as they drew their swords and hefted shields. Some hefted their short spears, the usual iron-born spears. Ready, Uncle Roderick bellowed. The long spears came down. Longer than usual, reserves up. More men thundered into the shield wall, more spears came down. There was a long singing moment of tension, and then, as the first of her father's men started to approach them, Lord Harlaw raised his sword. Now. There was a pause as the men on the cliffs passed on the word, and then the bows started to sing, before the other noise happened. The thump of the catapults. There were 5 of them, all that they'd been able to build in the time. 5 catapults and 7 scorpions. Stones were hurled through the air. Stone and great red-hot iron-tipped bolts, all at the other ships as they approached the shore. Most missed, some hit, more screams, more ships slewing about or starting to list. Spears met spears and came back red. The longer spears tended to win, but it was not a one-sided process. She looked at the men and then at the others forming up on the beach. Archers being shouted at by Victarion. She pointed at them, but before she could utter a word, orders were being shouted on the cliffs. Arrows sheeted down and then a great stone impacted in the middle of the enemy archers, sending sand everywhere. Men were screaming all kinds of things. The drowned god came from the beach, whilst Harlaw and even the reader came from the shield wall. She nodded at her uncle and then ran down to the wall to encourage the men, realizing after a moment that he was at her heels. Push, she bellowed. Push. It was an eternity of fighting. After that, she felt, rather than heard the stones of the catapults going overhead, heading for the other ships, the snap of the scorpion bolts as they hissed through the air. The enemy had scorpions too, but they were running out of ships. Men with swords tried to beat their way through the spears, and those were the men she killed. Sometimes they had faces she recognized, and then she heard the voice, the bellows, the carrion. Greyjoy was staggering forwards. A great axe with a wicked blade in one hand, and a shield with many arrows embedded in it in the other. His helm was a ruined thing, missing half the limbs of the kraken, and there was blood running down his face as he bellowed like a maddened bull. But then there was an answering shout. Uncle Roderick was there, his sword in one hand and his shield in the other, his faceplate down. He slammed into Victarion, making the bigger man reel backwards, before rallying. The axe swept up and then down, but was met by the sword. This time the reader staggered back, before slamming into Victarion again. The shield battered into him and then the sword bit into Victarion's elbow. The bellow redoubled as the axe wavered, and then a spear came in from one side and punched into Victorian's knee at the joint of the plate armor he was wearing. Her uncle screamed, before Lord Harlaw's sword came down again and slammed into what remained of Victorian's helm. The impact threw his head back, and then he slumped to his knees and then onto his side. "Hurlu!" The cry burst from 100, no, 200 throats, or more. The men from the Iron Fleet were retreating now, running for their ships, running from the thirsty spears and the hungry arrows. She could hear horns in the distance, and she looked seawards. The ships of Harlaw were at the entrance to the cove, and she found a strange feeling sweeping over her, joy and mourning. This was victory, but victory at a terrible cost to the Iron Islands. Gods damn her father. Robb. When they first caught sight of the night fort, a large part of the party paused a little to stare at it. It was a ruin indeed, with broken walls and roofs jabbing up into the sky. Here and there they could see new timbers and roof tiles, though the damage of centuries was being patched up, slowly it seemed, but it was being repaired. But as they drew closer to it, the more he felt that something was wrong. "Suffrees, sir," he called out to the sour-faced man. "Is there supposed to be a party of your men at the night fort? I can't see anyone there." The master-at-arms at Castle Black shot him a look that seemed to combine surprise and very grudging respect. "I was thinking the same thing. There's supposed to be a party of builders and volunteers there, 20 strong. Why so few?" A glower, and then a shrug. "Nightfort's the oldest of the castles. Biggest of them too. The resources needed to get it habitable would be enough to restore 2 or even 3 of the others. We've got more volunteers coming in, but for the time being we've just got enough men there to repair the worst of it, and just make a small part of it ready for when we send more men and resources to the bloody place." He peered at the approaching gates. No smoke coming from it, no sign of a man on the gate, nothing. "I don't like it." He nodded and then turned to Theon. "There might be trouble up ahead. Keep that bow of yours at hand, and watch the upper parts of the building. I've got a bad feeling about this." Jensen nodded at him and then slowly unslung his bow. "Let the direwolves loose as we approach the gates." It was a good idea, and he nodded. Before looking over at Jon, his brother seemed to sense something wrong as well, judging by the frown on his face, and they exchanged a nod. Brother. Jon was his brother, no matter what anyone said should the secret ever come out. The wildling seemed to sense something, as well as they approached the gates. Ygritte's bow came out as well, casually, whilst Tormund Giantsbane seemed to be sniffing a lot, as if he was trying to suck sustenance out of the very air through his beard. The courtyard was deserted, but was at least clear of obstacles. He could see that trees had once been growing through the flagstones, but that they had all been leveled, and then cleared completely, and the wood stacked up to be reused, eventually. Scaffolding could be seen in what looked like the Great Hall. Most of the party dismounted, with the exception of Tyrion Lannister and Val, both of whom were looking about with frowns. All 3 direwolves were on the ground, and were looking about with ears pricked and whiskers whiffling as they sniffed the wind. It was Grey Wind who stiffened first, and then sniffed at something on the ground, before looking up at him. He took a long step over, and looked down. There was a smear of blood on the ground. Looking up he peered at Theon, who was apparently fiddling with something on his saddle, using the horse to conceal the fact that he was actually fitting an arrow to his bow. Being watched, Theon mouthed to him. 2 archers on the roof. He nodded slightly, before looking at Sarah Dollizer and the others. They were tense as well, and as he looked at them, he could see that the bloody man was on the point of shouting a challenge to whoever was out there. It was then that the man of the Night's Watch saw how alert Robb was, as well as Theon's eyes sliding sideways to the roof. He opened his mouth for a moment, and then he tensed and nodded reluctantly, as if he was ceding command of this situation to Robb. He clenched his fist as he held it against his chest, and then he splayed 3 fingers at Theon, who nodded, then 2 fingers, then 1, as he withdrew his last finger. Theon sprang back, and the bow sang, before he pulled out another arrow, knocked it, and then loosed again. "To arms!" Robb shouted as he pulled ice free of his sheath on his horse. Ygritte's bow was singing as well, and there were no fewer than 5 bodies slumping down, falling down off the roofs and onto the flagstones. They were dressed in furs. Wildlings. They were wildlings. Seeing movement to one side, he turned. A mass of men in furs were emerging from deeper in the night fort, led by a hulking man who hefted an axe with a long handle. He seemed to have lost a lot of fights, given the scars on his face and the way that he was limping. He was also glaring at Mance Rayder with open hatred. "Friend of yours?" Robb asked dryly as he hefted ice. "Just a fool who hated the fact that most of his tribe followed me and not him," Rayder said with a rather unsettling grin on his face, as he pulled out his own sword. "Ho, Torget, come to lose again? I'm going to gut you like a fish, Rayder," the hulking man growled. "Taken up with crows, have you? You always were soft." "My people are passing through the wall and are safe," Rayder grinned. "Where's the rest of your lot? Abandoned north of the wall? How many have you lost?" There was no reply, just a bellow and a rush as they came at them. Septimi's bows were singing again, but Robb barked a command to a snarling gray wind to stay back, before he faced the man coming at him. He was dressed in all kinds of furs. He had a rusty-looking sword in his right hand, and Robb swung ice as father had taught him, in a forward slash that shattered his enemy's sword, and then bit deeply into his side. The man let out a choked scream, and then Robb kicked the blade free and hacked his head off. This seemed to alarm the next man, who made the mistake of checking his rush a little. Ice caught him in the chest and crunched into something, because the man fell where he stood with a spray of blood upwards. He wrenched the blade free again, and set his jaw at the next man, who had a small shield and an axe. The shield shattered when ice hit it, along with the man's arm. He screamed and dropped his axe as he clutched at the wound, which was why he never saw the Valyrian steel blade as it met his throat. Memories were hammering at his mind, memories of the battles he'd fought against the Lannisters. Oxcross came to mind. "The North," he found himself bellowing. "The North and Winterfell." Another man came at him, and he swung twice, once to lop the poor bastard's hand off, and again to reduce his face to a bloodied ruin. Men were avoiding him, which was a good thing. He could pick his own fights now. Not that there were many of them left, although one of Ser Alizer's men was down with a head wound that looked fatal. The sour-looking man was fighting like a man possessed by cold fury, with 3 bodies at his feet and 2 in front of his Night's Watch brother. A very pale Jon had killed 2 men, and Theon's bow had claimed at least 3 more. As for Mance Rayder, he was still fighting this Torgets. The king beyond the wall was unhurt, which was more than could be said for the hulking Axeman. He was bloodied and looked as if he was tiring, which was where he made his fatal mistake. He tried a great overhead blow, but he was too slow. Rayder was faster. His sword slashed out, and all of a sudden it was Torget who was gutted like a fish. He screamed as his entail spattered on the ground, and as he screamed everyone paused to stare at him. The screaming ended when Rayder rammed his sword through his throat. Robb looked about. The fight was leaking out of the remaining wildlings, but as he turned he heard a sudden shout from the gates. There was a party of 10 men there, all wildling, who were throwing the carcass of the deer that they had been carrying to one side and drawing their swords, and they were in charging distance of Val and Tyrion Lannister. He turned and grabbed for his dagger, before throwing straight at the face of the leading wildling, as the 3 direwolves snarled and darted at the new enemies. The man never saw it coming. The blade slashed into his eye and he screamed and went down. But there were others. Vale threw her own dagger, whilst Tyrion Lannister drew his sword, and then there was another shout from the gate, and 3 cloaked and hooded figures were there. Swords shone in the hands of the leading 2, whilst the third had daggers that flashed through the air and into the backs of 2 of the rearmost wildlings, who screamed and then collapsed. The 2 swordsmen were obviously friends, or had trained together, because they slammed into the wildlings like a well-trained pair of fighters. And whatever was in the hands of the taller of them, it sheared through the battered weapons that the wildlings held rather like ice had. Somehow he found himself in front of Val, and as another wildling rushed at them, he set his shoulders and unleashed a sideways blow that cut the man almost in half. And then it was over. The remaining wildlings threw down their weapons and cried for mercy. Robb lowered ice and stood there panting. There was blood all over the place, not a little on him. Grey Wind and the other direwolves were looking rather pleased with themselves. "Do you know how close you got to getting a dagger in the back of your head?" Val said acerbically. He looked at her. "I thought that you threw your only dagger." She sent a flat look his way, and then all of a sudden there was a throwing dagger in both hands. "You thought wrong." He tilted his head and looked at her. She was nothing like any other woman he had ever met. "I did indeed think wrong," he replied, before nodding at her. "A valuable lesson for me." She blinked at him, as if he had surprised her a little. "And who?" said Saralazar, as he stepped forwards. Might our new friends be? He stared hard at the three at the gates. The tallest of them sheathed his sword and then pulled his hood down. He was blond, about 10 years older than father, judging by the touch of gray at his temples, and had a white patch over one eye. Just some passing travelers, he said cheerfully. Why, Tyrion! Hello there! Tyrion Lannister stared at the man, who was now framed by two young men, both of whom seemed to have Summer Islander blood in them. When he finally spoke, it was at a squeak. Uncle Garyon? Well met. Interesting company you came with. And then he looked about with a smile. Uncle Garyon? The squeak was still there. Yes. Garyon Lannister peered at his nephew. Are you all right, boy? Uncle Garyon. The squeak was gone, replaced by flat incredulity. Yes, it's me, your Uncle Garyon, he spoke as to a small child. Uncle Garyon, and then Tyrion Lannister's eyes rolled up into his upper eyelids, and he slumped over onto the neck of his horse in what looked like a dead faint. Tyrion Lannister darted forwards and caught his nephew just before he fell off. Well, he said wryly, I think he missed me. Cats. The terrible threesome were playing in the courtyard again, watched discreetly by Jory Castle and his smiling wife. From the way that young Edric was moving his arms stiffly and shuffling, they were playing knights and whites again, and she shuddered delicately for a moment. How quickly they turn terrible things into games, she muttered. They're only boys. Someone cleared a throat to one side, and she started slightly and looked over. Ah, Lewin had come through the open door, and was standing there with his usual look of stoic patience. I'm sorry, my lady. I did knock, but you seemed intent on the view, so I entered. Heeding her nod of apology, he walked up and looked out of the window. Ah, knights and whites again? It's just a game to them, she sighed. Just a game. They don't understand the danger, do they? They're young, my lady, Lewin sighed. They think that their fathers are giants who will beat back any threat. They see no danger. Not yet. Not truly. She sighed and then shook her head. When the winter comes, if it is a second long night, who knows when it will end? By that end, we might see all three of them wielding swords for real. It chills my heart, Lewin. He looked at her with sympathy in his eyes. No parent ever wants to see their child go off to fight a war, my lady, but there are times when it must happen, no matter much you might not want to see it. There was a long pause, and then she nodded. Aye. How go things anyway? The maester removed a book from under his arm and then placed it on the table. The amount of land under the plow for the harvest to come is something of a record one. The number of people who are sowing what they can where they can is astonishing, my lady. And with so much being brought in by these volunteers, well, there will be no shortage of seed anytime soon. Barley, oats, grain, it is all being grown. And those rich enough to have the glass houses are taking full use of them. All kinds of requests and notifications are coming in as well. The Umbers are even talking about breeding a shaggier kind of cow for the winters to come. She looked up from her perusal of the book. Shaggier cow? One with longer hair, my lady. Very well, she said, feeling faintly bewildered. Tell them to do their best. Then she paused. What news of the Company of the Rose? They are about 10 days' travel away. She sighed. Odd to think of so many cousins to the nobles of the north being so far away, and for so long. The Maester of Winterfell pulled a slight face. I must confess, my lady, that I had wondered the same thing. There are certain oddities of timing to their existence that I find of interest. Cata looked up again sharply. Such as, the founding of the company was so very close to the capitulation of the last king in the north. That is interesting. No other families from Westeros saw family members go in such numbers. I wonder why, and given the book in the hidden room detailing what they seem to be earning, well, I think that their leader needs to be asked about the reason behind the founding of the company. There seems to have been closer links between it and Winterfell than many might have thought. That was indeed interesting. And she paused to think about it. I think that might be something to ask them about. I just wish that Lord Stark, was home by the time that they arrive. Lewin nodded somberly, and then there was the sound of a knock at the door. They both looked over to see a rather sullen-looking Arya standing there. You asked to see me, mother. I did. Come in and close the door behind you. Arya obeyed orders, shooting the occasional glower at her and Maester Lewin, although she seemed to be glad that it was just those two adults she was facing. Kat sat down in her chair, and then, when Arya also sat in front of her, did her best to give her second daughter a hard stare. Arya seemed to be a bit restless at first, and then she stopped, straightened, and much to Kat's surprise stared back. "Arya," she said eventually, "Septa Mordin has been to see me. She is very disappointed in you. You seem to be refusing to learn any of her lessons, and she's upset." Arya seemed to droop slightly before bristling a little. "I'm very sorry for upsetting her," she said stiffly after a long moment. "But I'm not learning anything useful from her." She frowned slightly. "What do you mean useful?" This time Arya rolled her eyes. "Useful, mother. All she teaches me is embroidery, and morals, and what the seven think." Kat counted to 10 in her head, and then looked severely at her daughter. "Arya, that's what she's here to teach you." Arya sent back a flat glare. "What? How to be a lady?" "Yes, Arya, you—" "But I don't want to be a lady. That's not what I want, at all. And given what's coming, why should I need to be a lady?" Kat rocked back in her seat a little, astonished by Arya's vehemence. "Arya," she tried to rally, "you are my daughter, and you— I am a Stark of Winterfell. I do not need to be a lady. I need to be a Stark. Winter is coming. That's our motto, isn't it? Well, I need to be a proper Stark. I don't need to know about embroidery, or the seven-pointed star. I need to know about how to use a sword, and a spear, and to ride a horse. And I need to know about the old gods, not the new. I've seen the old gods speak through the mouth of my father and my brother, so I've heard them." It was an extraordinary outburst, at first spoken and then rising to a shout at the end, and afterwards her daughter sat there and looked faintly terrified, but also very resolute. "Arya," she replied eventually through a very dry mouth, "you do need to be a lady. You have certain obligations as a daughter of Lord Starkend." "Mother, a long winter is coming. It might be that another long night is coming. The others are coming. I know it. You know it. Everyone knows it. If the wall falls, and the others besiege Winterfell with an army of whites, what am I supposed to do? Embroider something, and throw it at the nearest whites. I need to know how to fight. I am a Stark. I am a warg." And after saying that last impassioned word, she went as white as a sheet. "Arya," Kat chided, "just because you found that crypt with those tombs, that does not mean that you are a warg. Then why did the old gods call me a warg when they took Jon over?" She paused as her thoughts tumbled over a precipice. "I don't know, but— Mother, I am a warg. So is Bran, and we need to learn how to warg better. Can Septa Mordin teach us that? No." And with that, her daughter sprang up and ran from the room, her eyes filled with tears. "Arya!" Kat cried after her in vain. "Arya!" But she was gone. Kat passed a despairing hand over her eyes. "Maester Lowen, what is to be done with her?" There was a pause, and then she looked at the Maester, who looked deeply troubled. "Lowen, what is it?" The older man pulled a slight face. "Given what has happened of late, well, I would take her claims seriously. Much has woken up of late, my lady. Why should we not think that she and Bran could be wargs?" She thought about it for a long moment. There had been a time, not too long ago, when she would have dismissed it instantly. But now, I think I need to talk to her again. Tyrion— It was possibly the oddest dream he had ever had. He could see Uncle Garyon peering down at him and asking him if he was all right before turning into a bird and flying away. And then Father appeared and started to shout at him. Only it wasn't really Father. It was someone who sounded like Sarah Lisser Thorne, who was shouting at Mance Rayder about wilding treachery, only to have Rayder reply that he'd killed 3 of them himself, so could he please shut up. And then finally there was the sound of Poderick Payne asking if there was a well nearby. At which point he opened his eyes and stared blearily at the sky. What had happened? He was lying down on something very cold and flat. Oh wait, flagstone. He sat up and discovered that Mance Rayder, Sir Alistair Thorne and Robb Stark were having a very intense conversation about the corpses that lay all over the place. "Are you all right, my lord?" The words came from a rather worried Poderick, who was clutching a bucket and looking at him in a very concerned manner. My uncle. I had the oddest dream. I saw my dead uncle Gurion." Tyrion all but stammered in reply, "And he was here." "Wait, how did I get to the ground? Did I fall off my horse? If I said that it wasn't a dream, will you faint again?" The question came from behind him, and the voice was that of Uncle Gurion. Tyrion froze in place, and then very carefully turned his head to look behind him. It was in fact Uncle Garyon. "Good gods," he whispered, and then he stood up and peered at the other man, who was watching him worriedly. Is it really you?" "Well, who else would I be?" Tyrion asked the question with a baffled frown, before smiling in that crooked way that he sometimes had. "Hello, Tyrion. How have you been?" He thought about that for a long moment, before standing up and walking over. "I thought," he said hoarsely, "that you were dead, Uncle Garyon. Dead. Where have you been?" Tyrion sighed deeply and then scowled at his feet for a moment. Tyrion looked at him during that moment. His uncle was a little thinner than he remembered, and then there was that eye patch, with appeared to be a scar visible on the skin by the top and bottom of it. Finally, he looked up again. "I was in the Summer Islands," Garyon said, eventually. "I've been there for some time now, with my family there." Tyrion blinked at him. "Your family? There? What family?" Targaryen looked to one side and gestured for the young man who was standing to one side and looking awkward to join them. He was almost as tall as his uncle, with dark blonde hair and, oh yes, this was interesting. He was only half Westerosi. What was the other half? "This is my son, Alaryon." "And Alaryon, this is your cousin Tyrion." The younger man did not stare. He merely smiled politely, ducked his head a little and held out his hand. "Honored to meet you, cousin." "Honored to meet you, cousin," Tyrion answered, shaking hands with more than a little bemusement. "Uncle, would you mind explaining a few things, such as the fact that cousin Alaryon here must have been born long before you went missing in the smoking sea?" His uncle coughed a little at that, before looking around. More than a few of the others were watching their reunion, and he sighed. "Let's get somewhere more comfortable, shall we? This will be a long tale." They moved towards the great hall there, a place that had seen some repairs. Poderick, or Pod as he needed to be called, as Poderick was far too long a name for his face, scurried about as he first peered up the chimney and then kindled a fire in it to cook their food, whilst Mance Rayder and Saralisar Thorn supervised the assembling and burning of the various bodies. The Starks and the others watched and listened quietly as Uncle Garyon sat down on a bench that looked as if it had been repaired recently. As for Tyrion, he sat on a very battered stool and watched at his uncle, made himself comfortable, pulling the sword at his side to one side. Tyrion eyed that sword carefully. He'd seen it shatter weapons. It had to be Valyrian steel, surely. After a long moment, his uncle took off a locket that had been hanging around his neck, hidden by his shirt, and opened it, before handing it over to him. Inside was a little painting of a woman. She had dark skin, brown hair, and a brilliant smile. "Her name," said Uncle Garyon in a voice that combined wistfulness and love, "is Alara. I met her, just before Robert's rebellion started. I was in Mirror, on a trade mission for your father. She was there on a trade mission from the Summer Islands, for her own father. We met, we talked, we haggled. And somewhere along the way, we discovered that we had that most dangerous of things, the same sense of humor, that led to a connection, and then an attraction, and then, well, you can guess where I'm going with this." "You fell in love," Tyrion smiled. His uncle had had such a look on his face when he has mentioned Alara that he barely knew him for that moment, a look of tenderness and memory. "I fell in love. For 2 weeks I wandered about like a love-dazed child. I wanted to marry her straight away. And then I realized something. That father would never have agreed to your marrying her," he said. The words with a great deal of bitterness. "Father has views on marriage alliances conducted without him." "I know, Tyrion." And then in a moment of absolute clarity, "I knew that I had to keep Alara safe from your father, that Tywin could never know about her. So I never told anyone about her. Every time I went to Essos on business, or looking for evidence of Tommen's fleet and Bright Roar, I would find the time to meet her. She gave me Alaryon and other children that you'll one day meet. And oddly enough, she didn't agree to marry me at first. She'd love me and bear my children. But, well, the Summer Islands are a different place. And every time I went back to Casterly Rock, I'd smile and watch my language and give every impression that I was the same old Xerion. I think that Tyget suspected before he died, but he never said anything. And yes, that meeting that led to Joy being born was a ruse to put your father off. Alara knew it was her idea. The sound of bodies being dragged off came to one side, and they looked over to see that the last of the dead wildlings were being pulled over to a makeshift pyre by the remaining live wildlings. Anyway, Gurion said as he watched. The irony of my time in the Summer Islands with Alara and our growing family was that it gave me a missing piece in the puzzle of what had happened to our ancestor and his fleet. I found by chance a reference in a log from about the right time written by a captain of a swan ship that said that he had seen a storm-battered fleet with red sails being driven by high winds to the southeast of the islands. And on the sails were golden lions. We always thought that Tommen II must have left Volantis with his fleet and gone east. We never thought about if he'd gone south instead first, and then been caught in a storm. So on my last voyage east, I bought a ship and recruited a crew. Tyrion ran a hand over his stubble. That would seem logical, he muttered, thinking about the map of the area. The Smoking Sea is particularly bad in the west, but I'm confused. Father traced you and your ship to Volantis, not the Summer Islands, where half your crew muted and you were forced to replace them with slaves. Gurion scratched his eyebrow and coughed in a rather embarrassed manner. Yes, that was a mistake of mine. Some of the idiots claimed that they thought that I had not been serious about going to the Smoking Sea. When I said otherwise, well, it made for an interesting few days. He peered at Tyrion. So, your father sent men to find out what had happened to me. Was he really searching for me, or for word on if I'd found Brightroar and then vanished? This was enough to earn his uncle a pointed look at the sword at his side. Uncle, you do seem to have a sword of Valyrian steel, or something like it, at your side. His uncle's bark of laughter drew many looks from the others. Gurion grinned and then raised a hand. I'll get to that part later. In the meantime, yes, I recruited slaves. And the moment that they set foot on my ship, I freed the lot of them. Told them to their faces. Some cried, some laughed because they didn't believe me, and then cried. His face worked for a moment. You had to be there, he said, eventually. Freedom given to a slave, well, you had to be there. Anyway, I had a plan for the Smoking Sea. I'd read a lot about it. I even went to the Citadel. Something had struck me about it, about the links between it and Blackwater Bay, and the waters around Dragonstone. The spears of the Merlin King, in fact. Tyrion blinked. The same kind of rock formations. Dragonstone has a fire mountain. What the masters call a volcano, that hasn't erupted in centuries, but Tyrion, some of the areas around that island are avoided by sailors that know the seas there. There are tales of the seas boiling near there in the past. If the sailors know which areas to avoid, I realized that I could learn to do the same in the Smoking Sea. I had a plan. I needed to map out where it was safe to sail through and where it was too dangerous. He thought about that for a moment. Uncle, that's positively brilliant. How? We set sail from the Summer Islands and found an island on the edge of the Smoking Sea that had a good-sized hill, and then I sat up there, with the best Marish glass I could get, and a map, and those of my crew, with the best eyesight, and I spent 3 days mapping every disturbance, every place where the sea boiled, or spat rocks, or even breathed fire. And we also looked for an island as tall as the one we were on, so that we could do the same thing further into the Smoking Sea. He paused, and we needed to. There was another ship in port when we left the Summer Islands, a Volantin, whose captain laughed a lot at me and said that he had eyes like a cat and that he'd beat me to Valyria. 2 weeks into the trip, after we'd hopped from island to island to island, we passed some floating wreckage. Part of the planking was charred, and there was the body of a badly burnt man, lashed to it. From the color of the planking, it was all that was left of the Volantin. Once they realized what I was doing, there was no further problem with the crew. By the way, lots of fascination, combined with them using their own eyes. We went deeper and deeper into the Smoking Sea, going from island to island, inspecting the area around us carefully. He rubbed his chin and sent a rather rueful glance at Tyrion. We saw many things, but one of them, do you remember when I once had to tell you that you couldn't be a dragon rider because there were no more dragons? Yes, he replied wryly. Although there are odd reports from Pentos that Daenerys Targaryen has 3 baby dragons at the moment. Yes, I heard that too. But there are others out there. I know, I've seen one that seemed bigger than the tales say, that Belian the Black Dread was. We saw it from a distance, this great dark shape in the sky, bigger than any creature I've ever seen, living or dead. It didn't make a noise other than the beating of its wings. It didn't deign to notice us. It just sailed over us and vanished into the clouds, leaving us speechless and not a little terrified. There was a dead silence in the great hall as everyone stared at Garyon Lannister. "You've seen a true dragon, Sir Garyon Stark asked. He seemed very pale for some reason. Then he nodded. "Your pardon, I am Jon Stark. I have, and that was not the last time that I saw the creature. Where was I? Ah yes. We went deeper and deeper into the smoking sea, mapping the seas around each island. It wasn't easy. And there were 2 times where the seas ahead were so unpredictable, they boiled at all kinds of times without any warning at all, that we had to change course. But we were getting closer and closer to our goal, Valyria. And then we finally approached the place that I'd been eyeing for days, a great crag standing proud in the sea, with a ruin on the top of it. It had been a stronghold built by the Valyrians. Its name was long since lost. But there was a dock on its southern side and stairs that snaked up the side of the cliffs. We had about a month's worth of food, but I was still getting worried about how much longer we could stay there in the smoking sea, and I really wanted to see that view from the top of it. There was a lot of wreckage outside the dock, and I was a bit worried about getting into it, but we managed it. Garyon paused and smiled slightly. If only I'd looked more closely at that wreckage. Never mind. We moored the ship, and I took some of my men up those steps to the top of the crag, made it with my legs burning and my chest heaving from all those steps. But the view, gods, we could see for miles around up there. The ruin was behind us, a wrecked building with huge walls, but we could so much from there. And then I saw it, just for a moment. To the north I saw ruined towers, like broken fingers jutting into the sky, with a terrible red glow behind it, before the clouds hit it. I have seen Valyria, Tyrion, just for a moment, but I've seen the place where the doom happened. The room was silent again, as all stared at Garyon Lannister. He looked around at them and smiled slightly. And then came the price. He sighed. We headed down the stairs again to the dock when they attacked us. His voice wavered for a moment at the gate. "Who?" Robb Stark asked from where he was sitting next to the wildling girl Val. "I don't know who they had once been. I just know that they were more what? They'd been men once. Now, well, their heads were not human. They had been changed. Some had the heads of dogs or similar creatures, or wolves. Some had the heads of lizards. They were led by 2 great men with the heads of bulls, holding great 2-headed axes, and behind them all stood what I thought at the time was the oldest man I'd ever seen, a hunched man dressed in black. His face was so wrinkled I could barely see his eyes, and all he ever did was point with a gnarled finger. They overwhelmed us. We weren't expecting a fight. All most of us had on us were daggers and knives. They killed some of us, but they were trying to take us prisoner, not kill us all. Something got me at the back of my head, and when I came to, I and the others were being dragged into tunnels in the base of the crag that we hadn't noticed, and then upstairs, lit by driftwood torches. Eventually reached a great hall with pillars, and at the end was a dais and a chair, and a man that realized was the actual oldest person I'd ever seen. He was dressed in what might once have been white robes, but which were now filthy, and, well, he looked like a madder and more ancient version of Aerys Targaryen. Long white hair, eyes that were wide and bloodshot, fingernails that were long and twisted. Oh, and he was far madder than Aerys had even been. Aerys had been sane compared with this lunatic. All he spoke was Old High Valyrian, and the only volume he knew was the top of his voice. The last Dragon Lord he called himself, but if he had a name, he never said it. I just named him the lunatic. We were traitors, he said. Traitors and spies and thieves trying to take his great work from him. Or at least that was what I thought he said. They dragged us from the room and into a large cell. His uncle paused for a long moment and then accepted a wineskin from his son, who was watching him worriedly. "Thank you, my boy," he said, after drinking. He smiled at Tyrion. "He worries about me sometimes. This is the part of the tale that starts to bring back nightmares sometimes. We were prisoners for days, fed with our own supplies. What the guards ate I'll never know. Nor do I want to know. Every other day, they took 1 or 2 of my men and never brought them back. We didn't know what had happened to them, until the 4th day. I saw a new guard, a man with the face of something like a boar, and on his forearm he had a tattoo of a mermaid. I remembered that tattoo. It had been on the arm of one of the crewmen that had taken away, and then I knew what they were doing to my men. I went a bit mad at that point, roaring and screaming, bellowing for that madman to come down. I made so much noise that the old man in black, the steward as we had named him, came and stared at me, and then flickered a finger for the guards to grab me. They dragged me before the lunatic on his throne, and I tried to free myself and kill him. He laughed at me as I raged and swore vengeance on him, which made me even angrier, until eventually I swore that I wouldn't rest until he was dead, that I, Darkyn Lannister, would come at him with everything I had. He laughed even harder at that, almost gleefully. "Another lion," he crowed, and then he giggled something about new for old and then something about lion meat being all the better for dragons. And then his mood changed, and he started shouting some mad rant at the steward as I was dragged back to the dungeon. They took no more of my men after that. They left us alone. But 2 days afterwards, the steward came to the dungeon. He didn't say a word. He just stared at me for a while and then left. For 2 days after that, he did the same thing. On the 4th day, he finally said a single word. "Lannicepted." He spoke in a voice that was old and unused, as if he hadn't spoken in years. I just stared at him. "Yes," I said. "I am a Lannister. I am Darkyn Lannister." He stared back at me. Does Casterly Rock still stand?" I gaped at him. "I confess it. Yes," I said, "it does." And he looked at me, and then he hung his head and left. The day after that, well, we all woke up at the same moment, because we could all hear the voice of the lunatic. He was chanting something, chanting it in a variant of High Valyrian that set the hairs on the back of neck on end, because there was something dark and terrible about it. He called to the Valyrian gods by name, in a way that made me shiver, and he was calling on them for a boon, a service. I listened to that mad voice speaking that invocation, and I realized that it was a spell. We'd been working on some metal spindles we'd found hinging a box of supplies, and some other pieces of metal that we'd been hoarding, and we thought that we had enough to try and force the lock when the guards weren't looking. We didn't need to. Suddenly there was a clatter down the corridor, and then the steward was there. He had a key in his hand, and he unlocked the door and gestured to us. "Come," he said. "Come." As we surged out, I looked down the corridor and I saw 2 guards on the floor to the left. They had bowls in their hands and the steward saw where I was looking. "Poison," he said, and then, "Come, you must go. He thinks he has what he needs. A spell. Come, weapons." And then he led us all down the corridor, hobbling like the ancient old man that he was. He led us to another room which he unlocked for us. It was filled with weapons, Tyrion, weapons and armor from all over Essos and Westeros. Who knows how many ships had docked at that crag in the past. My men fell on everything with glee. The steward pulled me to one side though. Spell is a summoning. He seemed to be getting more and more voluble with time. He summons the greater Doomwing, a wild, feral dragon. He seeks to enslave its mind. Dangerous. He needs a noble blood, sacrifice. And then he led me to the back of the room. There was a long shape on a shelf at the back there, something wrapped in a faded red piece of cloth. He took it, and he gave it to me. I unwrapped it, and then I saw what was in it. I almost reeled. I knew what it was at once. Bright Roar. He pulled out the sword and held it tipped down to the floor. The sword of Tommen II, king of the Westerlands before the conquest. I looked at it, and up into the face of the steward. He covered my hands as they gripped the sword with his own, and looked back at me. "I hope that you wield it with more wisdom than I did when I bore it." There were tears rolling down his face. "Pray in the stone garden for me. My folly led to a punishment that was cruel, long and cruel. Tell them. I died with honor." I wanted to ask who he was, because I only had one possible name in mind, but then he turned and walked from the room. "That way," he said, gesturing to the left. "Down 4 flights of stairs. Then right. Your ship is there." And then he was gone, heading right, deeper into the crag. Darkyn sighed and resheathed the sword, before swallowing some more wine. We made it 2 flights down before the guards discovered us. There was a roar and a clatter of boots, and they were on us. But unlike before, we were ready, and we knew that it was fight or die. Or worse. We fought like wild animals, and they quailed at sight of our swords and our bared teeth. We slaughtered all who came before us. Down we fought. Another level, and then another. The first of the bull-headed men found us there. He killed 2 of my men with that axe of his before I could finally fall on him with my bosun at my side. My bosun got that bastard in the side with a spear, and then I got him in the stomach and gutted him. The second found us in the passage that led to the ship. He was older, I think, and more experienced. He killed 3 of us and then hacked the tip of my bosun's spear off, and then I faced him. That was a hard fight, even with Brideroar in my hand. He was good, very skilled, and he shattered my shield with 1 blow, and almost stunned me with a blow to my helmet with another. But then he gave me the smallest of openings. Just the smallest, and I took it. Brideroar caught him in the neck and he started to bleed. He roared with fury, and I caught him again. Someone got him in the leg with a spear, and as he went down on 1 knee, I got him again in the throat. But killing him made me vulnerable to a last final slash. As he used his dagger, cost me my eye. Tyrion's hand went to the eye patch, a hand that shook a little. The guards broke after that. They ran. We headed to the ship, and discovered that it was intact. They'd taken some supplies to feed us, but that was it. I was bleeding badly, and sitting by the tiller as the crew ran like madmen to unmoor the ship, and raise a small sail to get us around and out of the dock without hitting anything. The voice of the lunatic was still booming around us, and then all of a sudden I saw a shape in the clouds. That dragon was there. The huge one. It was flying slowly towards the crag, and as it flew, it shook its head and screamed in what was perhaps pain, or anger. I don't know what. All I know is that the moment we saw it, we all sprang to the sheets in panic. I was pulling on ropes as we raised sail at a speed that was very dangerous, in such a small space, but we managed it. I collapsed by the tiller again. Blood running down my face as watched the cliffs go past with greater and greater speed. And then 2 things happened. The first was that I saw that one of the wrecked ships at the entrance had faded. Very faded. Red sails and a figurehead that was a lion. The second thing was that the voice faltered and then stopped. There was a scream of pain and then a bellow of rage about traitors. I think I knew then that the steward was dead, and then there was another pause, and then the lunatic started chanting again. But now there was a desperation about it, an air of panic, as if he was trying to control something with his voice alone, that things had gone horribly wrong, because he knew that we had escaped. And then there was this noise. It was as if the dragon was screaming, but then the scream changed and became a roar, and then something deeper and more terrible, and then the top of the crag just vanished in a great ball of fire and flame and disintegrating rock. The noise was indescribable. It was as if the sky itself had screamed, a noise that shook the boat and sea and all of us. The ball of fire turned to smoke, and then we could see the bits and pieces of debris hurtling through the air up and then down. I remember screaming orders when the first pieces splashed and roared into the water around us. Pieces of rock, dressed stone, wood, and, well, it must have been bits of dragon, and a lot of it was smoking or actually still on fire. My memories get a bit hazy from then onwards. 2 men were killed or injured badly by falling debris, and then I remember nothing. Apparently I collapsed. They got me to my cabin, dressed my wounds, and then, whilst I lay there dead to the world, my bosun plotted a course to get us away from that accursed place and back to the Summer Islands, as fast as possible. They told me later that fever almost killed me, not once, but twice. All I remember is a lot of very bad dreams. When they got me to Lawler, well, I thought that she was nothing but a cruel hallucination dreamt up by my mind. Her sister is their equivalent of a maester of healing, though, and between them they nursed me back to health. As you can see, he grinned wryly at him. Tyrion sat back and blinked. Uncle Tyrion's tale was astonishing. And you've been there ever since? It was a question that had to be asked. Yes. Tyrion stared at his feet for a long moment, and then looked up at him. I almost died, Tyrion. And for what? A sword. My Alara and my children almost lost me. That puts a lot of things into perspective. Home. What does that mean? In my case, my family. My children. So I stayed with them, and I knew that it was the right thing to do, because it was then that Alara agreed to marry me. She knew that I realized where I had to be from now onwards. He paused and then smirked a little. You have more than a few cousins now, including at least one that should have been born by now. Alaryon looked intensely embarrassed by that. Father, he started to say, do I have to tell people that? Yes, I do. I'm proud of it. Don't blush, boy. Your parents have sex a lot. Stop being so Westerosi. Someone snorted with laughter to one side, and Mance Rayder walked off with Tormund Giantsbane next to him, muttering about kneelers and their prudish ways. However, Tyrion looked at Brightroar. That steward, his words he couldn't have been. Could he? I don't know, Tyrion said somberly. I've always wondered. Valyria was a strange place that used magic more than we might have thought. Used it in ways that we can't even imagine. The man who called himself the last Dragon Lord, who knows who he was really? Or how old? There's a theory in the Summer Islands that the doom was caused by the Dragon Lords overreaching themselves, trying to cast a magic that caused the land itself to revolt. Maybe that's true. All I know is that magic is strong there, and that all things come with a cost attached. And with that Geryon stood. Right. So, what's for lunch, Ned? The line of wildlings never seemed to end. They came through the gate at Castle Black, as a long straggling column, all ages, in all kinds of conditions. Some were wounded, some were visibly pulling themselves along through willpower, alone. Some strode through fast and with grins, and others struggled through with grief etched on their faces, and their clothing. Some wore furs that had been stitched together with all kinds of threads, whilst others wore leather, or in some cases cloth. One little group caught his eye. A tall, grim-faced woman came through, with a small baby in a sling around her neck, and a large pack on her back. By her side trudged a small boy pulling a little sled that had a pile of furs on it. All of them looked tired, and, as the woman looked around Castle Black, her face worked for a moment, and grief cascaded across it. And then a moment later the mask of tired reserve was back. No one else was with her. Whoever the father of the children was, there was no sign of him, and Ned wondered what the story of that family was. Makes you think, doesn't it? The words came from Jeor Mormont, who had approached quietly from one side. Poor buggers. Aye, it does, Ned sighed in response. And if we don't hold the others here at the wall, then that's going to be what the people of the north look like as they flee past Moat Island. We stand here and we win here, because otherwise... The Lord Commander shivered a little. Aye, and don't I know it? He then sighed. At least some of my men are starting to get his head out of his arse. He jerked his head to one side, and Ned could see one of his senior lieutenants, Corin Halfhand, standing to one side and watching the wildlings with a peculiar look to his face. What's up with him? Ned asked. He used to think that the only good wildling was a dead one. Fair enough. They've spent centuries raiding our lands, and we've spent centuries tracking them down and sticking their heads on spikes. Now, for the first time, he's having to think of them as people who need to be saved from the others. Look at the poor bugger's face. He's a good man, but once he's got something in his head, it's hard to shift it. He'll learn. He's learning now. Good, Ned sighed. He hated to think about what must have happened to the Lord Commander in that terrible future that Robb had been sent back from. Robb had had word of a great ranging that had gone badly wrong. There was a pause, and then Ned heard a horn sound from the top of the wall. He looked up and frowned. What was that? Someone trying to get my attention, Jera muttered, and then he stumped off to the lift. Ned watched him go, and then looked back at the flow of men and women as they came through the gate. They included another group of giants and their mammoths, and he blinked a little as one of them noticed him and said something to the others. Before they all nodded their heads at him, ponderously, he nodded back at them, and they strode off through the south gate. What was it that they had recognized? His description, or the Fist of Winter. He looked down at the great mace. Why had it been hidden away for so long? He had no doubts about using it now. The times required it. But when had his ancestors put it away in that room? Ned! Dreyer was shouting his name from the lift as he came down in it. He frowned and then walked over to it. What's wrong? He asked as he approached the base of the approaching lift. There's a column of men coming in. Odd armor, from the color of it. They're bearing peace banners. Based on what some of the wildlings said, it might be the Thins. Ned paused and then nodded. Right then, I'd best look impressive, shouldn't I? J.R.R. barked with laughter as he burst out of the lift and then looked him up and down. Not too shabby, he grunted. You look a bit thin from all that riding, but you'll do. Then he looked around at Castle Black. The Thenn are coming. Some stared. More than a few swore, and some gripped the pommels of their swords, and looked grim. But the old bear's gaze beat down that of anyone who looked as if they might object. Ned turned to the gate on the wall and waited. And then a long double line of men strode through the gate. They were dressed in bronze armor, or what passed for armor. Some with leather shirts sewn with bronze discs and scales, and some in bronze cuirasses. All had a shield and a spear, the latter with leaf-shaped heads. They were led by a tall, lean man with a shaved head and face. He wore bronze scale armor, bore a spear with an elaborate head, and after a moment Ned realized that the man had no ears, just holes in the sides of his head. Frostbite, perhaps? The man raised his spear and the men came to a ragged halt. The leader of the Thetan looked about, and then his eyes fell on Ned and he seemed to collect himself slightly, before his chin came up a little and he strode over to him. As he approached, Ned could see that the man had been in a fair few fights, and then he was trying very hard not to seem nervous, especially when the man's eyes darted to the fist at his waist. "You are the Stark?" The Then spoke in the old tongue, the language of the first men, something that Ned was now very familiar with after all his studies. "I am the Stark," he replied in the same language. Placing a hand on the head of the mace at his hip, he added, "I bear the Fist of Winter. I am the first Stark in many years to wield it." The Then nodded slowly, before bowing his head. "I am Styr, Magnar of the Then. You lead us now. The long night is on us, as it was foretold. The others return, leading dark things. You hold the fist. Lead us. We will follow." His face worked for a moment. "We failed you," he said hoarsely. "We failed you." He stared at the earless man who looked so upset. "Failed me? I don't understand." The Star looked up at him. "Your ancestors gave my ancestors duties. Long ago. Keep the peace beyond the wall. Lead the free folk in keeping watch. Beware of Hopeorn." He closed his eyes for a long moment. "We failed to keep the peace, and the free folk and the Night's Watch fell into war. We failed to keep a good watch. Hopeorn awoke and we did not see it." He bent and laid his spear on the ground in front of him. "My life is yours. I will take your punishment on behalf of my people. My son, Sigorn, will lead the Then afterwards." And then he knelt and bowed his head. By the old gods, he thought, he expects me to kill him. Instead he leant down and picked up the spear. "Stand, Styr, Magnar of the Then. The Stark commands it." The lean man looked up uncertainly, and then stood. Ned looked him in the eye, and then handed him the spear. "Much has been forgotten south of the wall, as well as north. Old alliances must be reforged. My father was murdered before I could be told much about what it means to be a Stark, but I suspect that things were buried by a weight of years before then. The Thenim have remained true, though. You remembered old truths. Let us build on that." Story stared at him for a long moment, and then he nodded slowly. "We are sworn to the Stark, and the Stark alone, now. Command us." Ned nodded back and then looked at the line of men. "Is this all the strength of the Then?" "A part of it, more weight, beyond the wall. We have stripped the valley for the first time in centuries. Supplies, forges, grinding stones, we have brought it all." He said the words with simple pride. "Have your men pass on into the gift. Places have been set aside for your people," Ned said quietly. "You and I must talk, though. We must talk of many things with the Magnar of the Night's Watch." Satyr's shoulders seemed to relax just a little, and then he turned and bellowed orders to his men, who started to march through the south gates. Ned looked at Jair Mormont, who had been a fascinated spectator to the whole thing. "Time to dicker again, Jair." I'll fetch more ale." Piriston. The problem with old inscriptions was that they were, well, old, and they eroded, weathered down by wind and rain and sheer time. Fortunately, someone had once had the presence of mind to write some of them down before they wore away completely, and now he was sitting at a desk with ramparts of books looming over him, happy as a novice given his first glimpse of the library. The books were in excellent shape, and so they should be, but he was getting a bit frustrated. There were a number of particularly pertinent inscriptions and other records, but the main fact was that the exact history of the early part of the High Tower itself was, well, murky at best. No one knew who had built that lower course. Yes, there was evidence in the form of inscriptions that the first men had built the part above that. Bran, the builder, yet again, but again there was some ambiguity there. Bran the builder must have been a very busy man indeed. The lower part, with that strange stone. A cough and a sniff heralded the arrival of Marwyn, who peered at the collection of books. "How goes it?" "Slowly," he muttered as he made a note on a piece of parchment. "Which to say better than no progress at all. The earliest of the runes are problematic." "What about the runes on the gate?" "Ah, He smoothed the scowl from his face. Those are peculiar. I thought at first that they were an old variation of the tongue of the first men, but there is something odd about them. Different. They remind me of carvings I have seen near the God's Eye once, many years ago. I have a theory, but it remains in its infancy and cannot yet toddle. Marwyn gave him a rather baffled look. I see, he said, sounding as if he didn't. Then he sighed. Tudyk is declining. He wants me to take over his position. Hurston looked up and grinned slyly at the other man. Too much work? A slight groan was all the answer he needed. All that faffing about, all that paperwork. Gods. He shook his head. Then he looked at Hurston again. Word of the gate at the base of the high tower is beginning to spread. It's just a matter of time before it reaches the Star-Scepted. Now it was Hurston's turn to groan. Oh joy, he said sarcastically. Remind me again about the benefits of religion. Keeps the small folk quiet and stops nobles from being greedy idiots. They're always going to be idiots. Aye, but they can at least appear to be pious. This was a good point, and he nodded slightly. Well then, I'd love to see the reaction of a Septon to that gate. Whatever it is, it makes bladder control difficult. He looked back at the mound of books. I wish I knew what it is. It's old Marwyn. It's very old. Older than Old Town, older than the rest of the High Tower. And whatever's on the other side of it, well, I'm glad that it's locked. There was a long silence, and then the door opened on the far side of the room, and Abros walked in. A fat lad followed him, who was looking about the room with a great deal of interest. The Archimaester looked at Hurston and Merwin, and blinked more than a little. You two don't normally get on together. Driven together by research, Marwyn replied dryly, that and mutual griping about stupidity. Ah, said Ebros. Yes, well, we all roll our eyes at that. This is Samwell Tarly. Lord Willis Tyrell sent him here to carry out some research. Research about the founding of Highgarden and Garth Greenhand. Marwyn squinted at the lad. Tarly? Any relation to Randall Tarly? I'm his eldest son and heir, the fat lad replied. And you are Maester. He's Marwyn and I am Hurston. Hurston replied with a grim smile. Then he peered at the young man. You look nothing like your father. The lad shifted from one foot to the other and then back again. Yes, he said quietly. I know. It might have been pointed out to me quite a bit. There was a brief silence, and then Hurston looked back at Ebros. Why is he here? In this room? He needs access to some of the books you have. Hurston glared. I happen to be using them. Not all of them at the same time. Hurston, surely he can read some of them when you are not looking at them. He gestured at the rampart of the books. After a long moment of thought, Hurston reluctantly conceded that he might have a point. Why Willis Tyrell, by the way, not Lord Tyrell. Lord Tyrell is on a prolonged hunting trip, Ebros said, staring at the ceiling. Lord Willis is effectively in charge of the Reach at the moment. Hurston absorbed this for a moment. Well, he said eventually, anyone has to be an improvement on Mace Tyrell. Then he looked the boy up and down. Lord Willis sent you to research the history of Highgarden and Garth Greenhand. Yes, Archmaester. Why you? Well, the lad said with a gleam of something undefinable in his eyes, I do have some experience of finding information for Lord Willis Tyrell. And things. Other Bane, for example. They all stared at him. Other Bane? The weapon of the Gardener Kings? The weapon that hasn't been seen since the Field of Fire. Marwyn was openly staring. Yes. Tyrell, he said, with a hint of defiance. Then he pulled out a piece of parchment. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an initial list of books I'd like to take a look at. Hurston peered at the list. It was a very long one. It was possible that the lad might have a little potential. Captain, she pattered on next to noiseless feet along the corridor, and then very carefully peered around the corner. Arya had not diverted from her course at all, and was indeed headed to her room. Her shoulders were slumped, and Kat's heart ached for her daughter. She looked as if she was deeply sad, and Kat knew that it was her fault. As a result, she had been avoiding her own mother all day, and now Kat had had enough. She waited until Arya and Nymeria entered the room, and then she strode in behind them, and closed the door. Arya looked at her in shock, followed by some sullenness. Hello, Mother. Here, sit down. I need to talk to you. Her second daughter rolled her eyes, but obediently sat on her bed, with Nymeria sitting next to her. Good, said Kat, as she sat on the other side of the bed. Now, Arya, I need to talk to you. Mother, if this is about the Septa again. No, this is about the other matter. This is about you saying that you and Bran are a warg. The brows came down into a stubborn scowl and her daughter crossed her arms. What about it? Arya, this is important, and this is something that I am having trouble with. I know that the old gods have spoken through your father. Yes, I know. And Jon, I believe in the Seven, but I also believe in the old gods. I have to, too much has happened. You claiming to be a warg is important. I know that you believe it. So, help me to believe it. I want you to prove it to me. There. The words were said. She couldn't believe that she had said them, given her upbringing. Arya was directing a very odd look at her, a look that somehow combined utter disbelief with wild hope. You want me to show you how I warg? She swallowed. That part of her mind that said that this was all unnatural was screaming at her. Yes. Her daughter searched her face with her eyes, before making an eep noise of excitement, and then scooting back to that she was pressed against her pillows. This will take a little while, she said quietly. I've showed Bran, I'll show you. Mother, my eyes will turn white, and I'll be in Nymeria. You need to ask me to do things through her. I mean that I'll be in her, but you need to talk to her to give me orders. Does that make any sense? She ran her daughter's words through her head, winced a little but then nodded. Arya's eyes searched her face again, her own face more serious than she had ever seen it, and then she closed her eyes. A long moment of silence followed, and Kat could feel her heart pounding in her chest. Part of her mind was still pointing out that this was blasphemy, whilst another part of her remembered the red fire in Ned's eyes on the night of the direwolf. On and on that silence went, and just as she was starting to wonder what was happening, Arya's eyes suddenly flickered open. They were white, not the white of the roll of an eye, but an absolute white that almost glowed. Kat's hands flew to her mouth almost without her thinking about it, and then she noticed that Nymeria was standing to one side, her head tilted to one side. She huffed a little and leapt down to the floor, where she sat. Kat appeared at the little direwolf, her hands gripping her knees. Arya? Nymeria nodded, and then panted happily. Kat looked at Arya for a moment, and shuddered a little at those white eyes, before looking back at Nymeria, her mind whirring. Arya? What's 4 plus 3? The direwolf huffed again, before barking 7 times. 10 minus 5, 5 barks. Raise 2 of your paws. A front right and back left paw was raised. It's true, she muttered, utterly stunned. It's true. You are a warg. Nymeria darted forwards and licked her hand, before doing back and sitting on her haunches. Then she looked at Arya. Kat also looked at her daughter, and then she gasped as the whiteness faded from Arya's eyes, returning to their natural gray. Are you all right, Mother? Arya asked the question quietly, almost fearfully. It's just me and Nymeria, warging. I've read about it. Starks did it in the old days. There are statues in the crypts, and it's natural. Mother, it's not unnatural, and you're staring at me, and I don't know what else to say, and... Kat shut her daughter up the best way that she knew, by hugging her. You are my daughter, she said fiercely, as Arya squeaked and then melted into her embrace. My daughter the warg. And then she wondered what Ned would say. It would not matter to him, she knew. Arya would always be Arya. Gendry. The long line of men on horses stretched ahead of him, and he winced a little as he tried to find a new way of seating himself on the saddle that didn't hurt. This wasn't his first time on a horse. He'd traveled on business a few times for Master Mott. He'd quite enjoyed it at the time. Of course he was now facing a longer trip, a much longer trip. He'd heard about saddle sores from some of the other men. He wasn't looking forwards to finding out exactly what they were like. His new clothes were taking some getting used to, as well. They weren't as nice as the clothes that Shireen and the others were wearing, but they were still better quality than he had ever worn before. And they were warm. It was colder than King's Landing here. Colder, but oddly cleaner, nicer. The smells were better. He'd lived all his life with the stench of the city in his nostrils. White Harbor had been so clean. And now the road was clean as well. A rider galloped past him, and he watched him go carefully. Lord Stannis had been very clear. Stay at the back of the column, watch the men around you, and be wary. There's some here who wish you ill, you can be sure of that. It all made him uneasy, and he'd taken to watching everyone carefully, especially the man in red cloaks. Lancer guards, he'd already had one good reason to be cautious. He'd found his horse to be a bit skittish that morning. Checking every part of the saddle, he'd found out why. A small caltrop placed under the saddle. If he'd mounted his horse, then a prong would have maddened it beyond belief. Lord Stannis had seen it when he surreptitiously shown him, and ground his teeth a bit. Well spotted, he had told him. Keep being careful, I'll set a good man to watch you. The good man in question was a knight, Ser Jorah Mormont. A knight, or the northern equivalent. He was riding next to him now, a tall and rather solemn man, with thinning hair. He'd seen him sparring with father in White Harbor. Father. It was still so strange to think that his father was actually His Grace the King of the Seven Kingdoms. Robert, the first of his name. It still made him feel strange inside. He'd seen his half-brothers and sister once or twice. They were very blonde, very much like their mother. Prince Joffrey, from what the guards and servants had said, was a right little shit, but Prince Tommen and Princess Marcella were said to be very nice. Kind even, although the little boy was oddly fixated with cats. And then there was the Queen. She was beautiful, if cold. Blonde and cold, like gold made flesh. She was traveling in a carriage that seemed to annoy her a lot. There had been talk of a wheelhouse, but on a trial run the wheels had all fallen off after a mile. He's also seen the sworn sword, or bodyguard, or whatever the seven hells it was, to Prince Joffrey. Sandor Clegane was large, had a fascinating helm in the shape of a dog, and was horribly scarred on one side of his face. He was, in a word, intimidating, and someone to avoid. The man was dangerous. He wasn't sure why, but he avoided him as a result. They rode a long way that day. A long and painful way by the end. He ached in all kinds of places that he'd rather not think about, and then there was the chafing. But eventually they came to a stout keep ruled by a large man, with manderly blood, and his doting wife, and 7 gods almighty. 7 children. Rhys Greensnow was some descendant of a manderly bastard, perhaps, and had had plenty of warning of the arrival of the king and his huge group, and probably coined from White Harbor to help with the cost of hosting them all. There was already a couple of beef carcasses being roasted as they arrived, and as the king boomed his pleasure at the welcome, whilst the queen sniffed and looked chilly. As everyone scattered to their various quarters, some inside the keep and some in the nearby inn, Gendry looked about, jiggled his legs and wondered if his balls would ever forgive him for the ordeal that they had just gone through. It was another half a day to the ferry over the White Knife and then the road that joined up with the King's Road, or so people said. Ser Jorah slapped his shoulder, nodded at him, and then walked off to join his all-but-wife Lyra. Hearing the puff-off of a bellows in the distance, he looked over to one side. Yes, there was a smithy there, and before he knew it, his legs had led him there. The blacksmith was a short burly man, with enormous black eyebrows, and a surprisingly deft swing of the hammer. His assistant, who was pumping the bellows of the forge every now and then, was cut from the same cloth, and was obviously his son, although by the way that the younger man was wiping his forehead and shivering, he was also ill. Both looked at him briefly as he approached, but said nothing, as he folded his arms and watched. The blacksmith was making a sword, and not a bad one. But as the steel started to be shaped, Gendry could see that the younger man was starting to shiver again, this time more violently. He pulled his jerkin off and strode over to the bellows, placing his saddlebags to one side. "Give over, I'll take it." The blacksmith's son peered at him. "Can you handle a bellows?" "I could at a King's Landing. I can do the same here." The 2 northern men looked at him, then at each other, and then the older one shrugged. "Get to bed, John. That wife of yours will never forgive me if you fall over in the forge. You're not well." The younger one opened his mouth as if to argue before shivering again, and then relinquishing the bellows, before taking off his leather apron, hanging it neatly up, looking around the smithy and then walking off. Gendry nodded and then pumped the bellows hard to get the temperature up a little, as it did not look quite right. This seemed to please the blacksmith, if a grunt and slight nod meant what he thought, who then reheated the sword before pounding on it again. "Apprentice? Aye. To anyone good? Master Mod in the Street of Steel and King's Landing. Passing, though? I'm with the King's party, on the way to Winterfell." A pause. "You heard the bellows, then?"
"Aye."
The sword was coming together nicely now. the steel just the right color, and Gendry watched as it was shaped to just the right manner before being quenched in the right bucket. The blacksmith looked up. "You here to just pump the bellows or work?" "I can take work if it allows me to do my own bit." "What are you working on?" He pumped the bellows hard for a moment, and then reached for his saddlebags. He didn't have much, but he had enough to start making 2 objects in White Harbor. One was a helmet in the shape of a stag's head, the practical kind. Mind. The other was a simple helmet, with a faceplate, something that didn't make him stand out. He pulled them both out and handed them over. The blacksmith turned each over in his hands, inspecting them carefully, as Gendry pumped the bellows every now and then, as well as adding coal in the right grill. "This is good work. Both of them." "Why a stag, though?" For my father. He wears Baratheon colors." "Oh, I?" Shrewd eyes searched his face. "There's 2 swords and 5 knives that need making over there. Finish them and you can work on whatever you like." Gendry thought about it and then nodded, before reaching for a leather apron. Best to hide in plain sight for a while. Edmure. He found father in his solar, sitting at his desk and staring at a map of Westeros on the wall opposite. Father was having one of his good days, which tended to outnumber the bad days at the moment, although as Maester Veemon had warned him, there was no guarantee that this would continue. As he closed the door, father looked up and smiled slightly. "You watched them for a long time from the ramparts." Edmure nodded slightly and then sat down. To see Uncle Brynden so changed. And that woman he was with, Brienne of Tarth, daughter of the Evenstar. Father shook his head slightly. "I will write to him of this. He would be proud of her." He nodded. And the Green Man, I don't know what to say about him. Septa Duncan the Tall, father shook his head. "I remember him from when I was younger. The noblest man the Kingsguard has ever had. I thought that he was long dead. But then there is something about being the Green Man that can't be explained." Father sighed, and then looked at the map again. "I never thought that I would see the day that the Green Men went forth from the Isle of Faces again. It was foretold a long time ago. The thought of living in a time of prophecy is disturbing." He looked at Edmure and sighed again. "Edmure, I do not know how long I have left. Vibin says that I might or might not recover from this wasting sickness. Given what has happened, I feel that I cannot take the chance of presuming that I'll get better. You must prepare to succeed me. Perhaps sooner than you might have liked, and there's a lot you need to know." "I know, father," he groaned. "Better skills at placing men in battle for a start. Highheart could have been nasty." "That's one thing," father said heavily. "But there's something more important. Tullys have ruled the Riverlands since Aegon's conquest. What is not widely known is that the coming of Aegon was predicted. The Green Man at the time sent word to our ancestor Edwin Tully to come and meet him on the Isle of Faces. It was a time of great tension. Harren the Black was looting everything that wasn't nailed down in the Riverlands, and even his own Iron Islands to build Harrenhal. He even broke the old agreement not to bother the Isle of Faces, or at least he tried to. He sent 3 ships filled with men with axes to chop down the weirwood trees there. They all vanished, never to be seen again. The Green Man of that time warned him never to try again, and also told him that even stone could burn. He didn't listen, and we all know what happened next. Baudelaire, the Black Dread, happened to him," Edmure muttered with ice sliding up and down his spine for a moment. "And Harrenhal burned." "Yes, Edwin Tully was told by the Green Man what would happen. The Green Man was his uncle." He sat up at this. "Green men have been Tullys. Green men have come from all over the place. All over Westeros. Our ancestors have walked on the Isle of Faces. It must always be protected. There was an agreement, and Edwin Tully made 2 trips there. One in which he was warned about the arrival of the Targaryens, and one in which he was warned about what would happen next. The warning was for his descendants. I suspect that the warning was for us. It came in 3 parts. One was that there would never be any more Valyrian steel, that the secret of making it had been lost. One was that another Valyrian secret would be lost, the one that would allow brother to marry sister and not have deformed or mad offspring. We both know how that ended up. The Mad King, Edmure said through suddenly, very dry lips. And the third? That the dragon lore of the Targaryens would one day fade, that the dragons would vanish. But that one day they would be needed again. on a day when fish were black on the Isle of Faces. And with that, father leant back and stared at Edmure with one eyebrow raised. He stared at father for a long moment, and then the ice reappeared on his spine. Wait, Uncle Brendan was on the Isle of Faces. The Blackfish was there. Yes, the day that your uncle named himself the Blackfish. I was angry and thought nothing of it. Then I eventually remembered what my own father had told me of that long ago meeting on the Isle of Faces. And I looked rather like you do now. Edmure swallowed and then ran a hand over his face. The implications were disturbing. Why would dragons be needed now? We both know why. You heard the call as loudly as I did. See others come. I suspect that they do. He sat there for a long moment, all kinds of thoughts and emotions roiling through him. Then, what must we do? Word has come from the Citadel that the Maesters are debating whether or not a long winter is coming. Given everything else, all this talk of the others, we must assume that it will be a second long winter. Father's nostrils flared for a moment. We face legends. Perhaps this is a time of legends. We need to be worthy of such a time, Edmure. Legends. He did not feel as if that word fitted him, could ever fit him. But he needed to try and rise to the challenge. Any word of the choices I face in marriage. Father chuckled slightly. I am making a list, no phrase of course, even though Walder Frey has always sent me the names of those of his daughters that are unmarried at the moment. What about Marianne Vance or Rosalind Mollister? Edmure felt his cheeks heat up for a moment. I've met Rosalind Mollister before. She's very pretty. Marianne Vance is half Frey, father. But not all Frey. The Vances are loyal to Riverrun. No Brackens or Blackwoods. A good idea, father. Aye, pick a girl from one family and the other would scream in protest. That said, the two houses have both done a lot to mend their relations recently. That great oath of theirs, as well as them both defending Raventry Hall. Well, I have to say that they are both striving mightily to do the right thing. We cannot do anything that threatens their fragile truce. Aye, Edmure muttered. Perhaps a meeting with Lord Mollister soon then. Father nodded. Soon. In the meantime, we need to work out what to do with our mad black-footed guest. He sighed, leant back in his chair, and passed a hand over his face. I believe in the Seven, but he is a disgrace to them. He places himself first. That much is evident. He is a fool. What does Vyman say about him? That he's a drooling madman now. He cannot explain his blindness. No one can. You were there? Can you explain it? He thought back to that night, and then he shook his head. No, the green man took his sight just with his words. I cannot explain it. Father just looked at him, and since he went mad and blind, the number of attacks and unrest by the faith militant have diminished. He seems to have been behind so much of it. So what do we do with him? That was a good point. He rubbed his chin. The man is mad. He has committed such crimes. But can we execute him now? If I could, I'd throw him off the ramparts and into the waters below, and good riddance to very bad rubbish. But I think that we must tread most carefully on this matter. I have sent a raven to the small council at King's Landing, asking what to do with the wretched man. The last thing we want is the High Septon to be critical. Edmure pulled a face as he thought this through, before nodding. I understand, father. At least he stopped befouling himself. Father shuddered a little, and then they both looked up at the tap on the door. It was Vyman, who was holding a letter in one hand, which he held out as he approached father's desk. I beg your pardon, my lord, but a merchant from Essos arrived bearing this. The seals on it are interesting. Father took the letter with a frown and peered at it carefully, his frown deepening as he looked at the wax seals that had been pressed into the front of it. Ah, he said eventually. Interesting. Then he opened it. Sit, Vyman. Tell me of this merchant. His name is Tyrin, my lord, from Myr. He says that he was headed to first Tyrish and then King's Landing, on business when he came upon the Golden Company, 3 of whom heard about him and then asked him to pass on that letter when he arrived in Westeros. He's quite away from King's Landing, Father muttered as he opened the letter carefully, unfolded it, and then read it. Then he frowned mightily and reread it, before putting it down and steepling his fingers under his nose for a moment. How to deal with this, he half whispered. How indeed? Father, Edmure prompted carefully. What? Oh, Edmure, it seems that the call wasn't just heard in the ranks of the Company of the Rose. Other exiles heard it too, and they have asked about the possibility of a pardon and a return from exile.
Who?
Edmure asked. Members of the Golden Company, obviously. Aye. They claim to be, well, members of Houses Strong, Lothston, and, well, Mud. Edmure stared at him, and then he reached for the letter and stared at the seals. My gods, he said eventually. Can it be true? I do not know, but the seals are right. Seals can be forged. They heard the call, they write the words of it. They might be lying. Aye, Father muttered, but the king in the hand must know of this at once. Think about the implications. Thrakmir leant back in his chair. Rufaimon was as white as a sheet in his own seat. Finally he looked up. The ripples are spreading, Father. Aye, and the Golden Company is likely broken. Riding with women was interesting. Well, not too much riding with them, more in company with them. Sort of. Craster had had 2 horses of his own, as well as a cart, and Jen had crammed a lot of supplies as well as all of her fellow wives into it. Craster's keep was no more, and the funeral pyre had been a great one. Well, no matter. He'd thrown the dismembered pieces of the bloody man into the growing inferno himself, and good riddance to him. The thought of anyone at all ever worshipping those things was wrong. The further south they'd rode, the more they had seen evidence that the wildlings were on the move, and in huge numbers. In places, the trees had been hacked down to allow the passage of what, from the ruts, might have been carts. And here and there was the occasional sign of a pyre, with charred bones visible. People had died nearby, and the wildlings had been burning them, had to burn them. Craster's wives had not been the burden that some had thought. They were all wildlings, but they had been grateful to them for killing their husband. The whole thing made his skin crawl. They'd stripped the keep bare of food and other supplies before it had been burned, and the amounts had been startling. As the wall loomed ever closer, he noticed Sarah Jeremy staring at the ground and the debris that some of the wildlings had left behind in their passage south. They're all moving, Sarah Jeremy muttered. All of them. He reined in quickly, dismounted, grabbed something off the ground and then remounted and spurred up to rejoin them as he pored over whatever it was before finally holding it up. Is that bronze? Ed asked as he peered at it. Aye, Tollet, it is. Bit of bronze armor, unless I miss my guess. Then make 2. A lot of heads turned to stare at him, not least Krister's head ex-wife. Then, truly, Sarah Jeremy hefted it and then tossed it carefully at her. The woman caught it and then looked at it intently as one of the other women took the reins for the cart off her. Fuck me, she said in a stunned tone of voice. Then, I never thought I'd see them this far south. She hefted it carefully and then looked at Sarah Jeremy. If the Then have come south to the wall, then that means that a storm is coming indeed. The others have come, and there is a saying amongst us that if the Then ever goes south to follow the Stark, then another long winter will come. There was a pause amongst the men of the Night's Watch as they looked at each other for a moment. Then Sarah Jeremy finally admitted, before we left on our mission north of the wall, word had it that Ned Stark was riding for Castle Black. Jin stared at him, and then at them all, with a pale face, before looking back at the wall. Then if the Stark has the Then behind him to the south of the wall, then the second long winter comes. They rode on in silence after that, until the wall loomed above them, and the gate to Castle Black could be seen in the distance. There was a long line of wildlings passing through the tunnel through the wall, and as they looked at that line, Ed saw Sarah Jeremy's jaw set, and the knuckles of his hands whiten on the reins, for a long moment, before he finally sighed and shook his head a little. It has to be done, he heard the older man mutter. It has to be. Ed could see Tywin digging in his furs for his horn, which he lifted to his lips and used to blow a single, long, dolorous blast that told those on the wall that Rangers of the Night's Watch approached. A tiny figure far, far above waved at them, and he sighed in relief as they approached the tunnel and then rode through. Craster's wives, on the other hand, seemed to be an odd mixture of relieved at being south of the wall and fearful at being at the heart of the Night's Watch. They were also astonished to see the huge direwolf sitting at the base of the stairs, next to a bearded man with long hair tied back. He was dressed in fine but functional dark leathers, and by the fact that the Lord Commander was next to him and talking quietly, he must have been important. Then he blinked a little. There were Stark banners flying here and there. Was that Lord Stark? Sarah Jeremy dismounted and nodded to the 2 men in front of him. Lord Commander, he muttered. Lord Stark. Sarah Jeremy, the old bear replied. Interesting company you keep. Cryster's wives, the ranger replied. Cryster's keep is no more. The man is dead. They seek passage south beyond the wall to be safe. Jiro Mormont's eyebrows flew up and down for a moment before he scowled and thought, send them on then. We need to hear your report. I'll have to make it with Tollett here. Ed stared at Sir Jeremy with something close to horror. Me? You? Something close to a smirk crossed his face. Tollett here has killed another. Everyone within earshot of this lifted their head and stared at him as his cheeks flamed. Aye, he said faintly. I did. The Lord Commander of the Night's Watch looked him up and down before tilting his head to one side. Well, let's hear this tale of yours. Lord Stark and the Lord Commander, with the direwolf loping ahead of them, led them all up the stairs to the Lord Commander's solar. There they found a man dressed in bronze armor, talking to Maester Aemon in what sounded like the language of the First Men. The first thing that he noticed was that the man in bronze had no ears. The second was that Maester Aemon's eyes were, could he see? When the Maester then turned to look at them, he almost walked into Sir Jeremy's side. So quickly did that other man stop in his tracks. Maester Aemon, Sir Jeremy, and young Tollett, I see that you have returned from your mission. And yes, I can see. His eyes twinkled with joy for a moment. A gift from the old gods, thanks to Lord Stark. Then he sobered a little. This is Styr Magnar of the Fen. He speaks the old tongue of the First Men. The earless man nodded at them and seemed to be about to take his leave when Lord Stark sat next to him, gestured with one hand and said something in the language of the First Men. Storr looked a bit shocked and then looked at Ed. I told him that you had killed what the Fen call a White Walker. We must hear your tale at once. Ed found himself coloring a little. This was going to be embarrassing, the tale of how he fell on his arse and stabbed blindly at what many had thought to be a myth. Well, at least they could speak of Cryster's fate. That still cheered him up a little. Tyrion, the Nightfort was not a place where he thought he could sleep easily, but so much had happened that he slept like a log that night. A guard schedule had been worked out, but he was not on it, much to his relief. No, he slept hard until dawn, when he was woken by Pod, who had a jaw-cracking yawn and a bowl of hot porridge. As the others woke and he ate his porridge, he looked about the building they were in again. It had been a great hall once. He wondered how much work it would take to get it repaired again. And then he worried about what kind of state the crypts were in. Much to his surprise, the letter written by Tyrek Lannister did not astonish his uncle as much as it had astonished him. Instead, Darrion had read it carefully, mulled it over, given it to his frowning son, and then raised his eyebrows at him. They had then had a silent conversation, conducted entirely in eyebrows and lip quirks. Uncle Darrion had a very close connection with his son. You don't seem that surprised, Tyrion said eventually. Uncle, were you following us, or coming here anyway? Darrion smiled slightly at him. Both. I'll explain later. He peered at his uncle. See that you do, uncle, see that you do. Now, we have some crypts to explore. It wasn't that simple, of course. First they had to deal with the wildling prisoners, who were the subject of a quarrel between Alliser Thorne and Mance Rayder that was only resolved by an annoyed Robb Stark, who reminded them both that Lord Stark had given orders that the wildlings be allowed to settle in the Gift before the winter started, and that Rayder had custody of them, whilst also reminding them of the laws south of the Wall. There had been a bite and snap of command in the voice of the young Stark that had made everyone stare at him and all but stand at attention, especially Rayder's good sister. There it was again, that nagging other feeling he had about the boy. He seemed older than his years at times. Was that due to the situation here at the Wall, or the fact that the North was a harsher place, or something else? He didn't know. Fortunately, Stark had spoken enough sense to get through to Thorne, and Rayder then agreed to let the prisoners work on the Nightfort for a week, as a penance before going south, and after that they could finally start to search the Nightfort. The lower levels of the castle were not like the upper levels. He could tell quite quickly that the Nightfort was mostly built on the bones of past Nightforts, and his fears about the crypts were unfounded. They weren't flooded or ruined. In fact, they were well drained and sturdy. The place where past Lord Commanders of the Night's Watch were buried was a somber place. Stairs led down to a chamber with passageways leading off to the right and left. Down each passageway were chambers hacked out of the bedrock, with slots in the wall for the dead. Stone box after stone box lay in those slots. They burnt their dead from the start, Tistalton? Greyjoy asked the question as he peered at the slots in one room with the light of a burning brand. Those boxes are too small for bones, other than ashes of bones. So it would seem, Tyrion replied, as his heart sank. Surely Tarek Lannister would have been buried in a similar fashion. Cremated and then the ashes placed in a box. But then why would he write to me and say to seek out his grave? Let us keep searching. The rooms are laid out in sequence, Robb Stark pointed out. The earliest Lord Commanders first, the later ones further up. Let's search the farthest room. This was a good idea, and it was indeed there that they found what they were looking for. Tarek Lannister's tomb, if it could be called that, was a box and a slot in the wall, but a larger slot than they had seen before, because there was another stone box next to it. Oddly enough, it was at just the right height for Tyrion to inspect it, and it had a small carving at the end. One of the Lannisters lion. He traced the symbol with a trembling finger, and then he clenched his fingers into a fist. The others behind him were all silent. After a long moment, he reached out and pulled on the end of the stone box. Stone ground on stone, and he panted a little as the box slowly came free, and then Uncle Garyon was next to him, adding his strength. The box slid out with greater speed, and then Alan was there to one side, helping as well. They laid the stone box on the ground once it was free. It was about 4 feet long, a foot wide and a foot deep, with a lid that seemed to slide along its long axis. He peered at it and swallowed. Let's see what's in this. The lid slid to one side, with the greatest of reluctance, and by the time it was off he was panting with exertion, a little, as he helped to lay it down. Only then did he look in the box. Inside was an old black cloak. Oh wait, there was something under the cloak. A set of shapes wrapped in oilcloth. His mouth was dry suddenly, and he moved the cloak to one side. There were 3 things in there. One was long, about as long as his arm, perhaps a bit longer. The second was smaller and the third a lot smaller. Small and square. He reached for the smallest one first. It was carefully stitched closed, but his knife soon opened. Inside was another piece of oilskin, also stitched closed, and inside that was a leather envelope. There was a name stitched onto it. This kind of thing always leaves me feeling a bit lightheaded, he muttered as he showed it to his uncle with a shaking hand. He knew I'd be here. He saw me. Dreamt me. Whatever the right word is. Darien looked at him carefully. You'd best open it, he said eventually, with a note of something that Tyrion couldn't quite place in his voice. We need to know what he wrote. He opened it carefully. Yes, inside was a letter. The writing thin and spidery, the script of a very old man. My dear Tyrion, again forgive my informality. This will be the last thing I ever write, as I am now dying. It is not something I am enjoying very much, so please excuse my curtness. You stand next to my ashes. You know why brothers of the Night's Watch are burnt. Or you will soon anyway. There are 2 packages in the box that I ordered to be buried next to my ashes. The first contains an axe. The second contains 2 daggers. All are yours. I took them from a forgotten vault in Casterly Rock, a place forgotten about since almost the time of Lansan the Clever. Our ancestors were fools who eventually grew arrogant. They forgot because it did not fit their version of the world, where they were more important than anyone else. The light fades. Or perhaps it is my eyes. There is more you must know. The axe is Rocktooth, the ancestral weapon of the Westerlands, the weapon that Lancel the Clever himself wielded against the others, when he fought side by side with the then Stark of Winterfell. Use it wisely and with pride. It's older than Lan himself. The daggers were also used by Lan. There were various names for them, including Lan's ears and Lan's whiskers, but their original name, according to the runes on them, were the warnings. Heed what they tell you. There is a room deeper in the crypts that you now need to find. Take the Stark who looks a bit like a Tully with you, and good luck, my boy. It was signed Tarak Lannister, and he felt more than a little faint as he handed the letter to his uncle, who read it with a look of the utmost seriousness. He left them for you, Dion said eventually, with a slight smile. You should claim them. His hands were trembling as he cut the stitches on the other 2 oilskin packages. The long one first. Inside was an axe. It was quite possibly the oldest thing he'd ever seen, a weapon ancient beyond words. It had an odd sheen to it, one that was familiar. Sky metal, he muttered as he traced a finger over it. And is that obsidian in the middle of it? It certainly looked like it. It might have been made by the same man who forged the Fist of Winter. Its handle was made from weirdwood, filigreed with threads of more sky metal, and there was obsidian set at the end of the handle, as well as 2 places in the blade. For some reason, he didn't want to pick it up. If he did so, Rocktooth was his, in a way that could never be taken back. He would no longer be studying the past would become a part of his present. If I take it, Father will never forgive me. I'd have something that he'd want. Your father wants Bright Roar, and he'll never have that. Take it, Tyrion. Shouldn't there be thunder at this moment? That's for Dorandans and the Baratheons that followed them. Tyrion, this is your moment. Take it. He reached out with those treacherously trembling hands and picked the axe up. It wasn't as heavy as he had thought it would be, and he hefted it for a moment. Nothing crashed overhead. There was no boom of the earth trembling beneath his feet. It was all a bit anticlimactic. I'll need something to carry this in, he muttered. A scabbard on my back, perhaps. I'll make something for you, my lord, Pod muttered behind him. I can stitch leather. Tyrion grinned at the boy for a moment, and then cut open the other package. Yes, there were 2 daggers in it, both made from the same metal, and both with weirwood handles. Gods, they were old. I'll need scabbards for these as well, he muttered as he ran his hands over them, and noted the runes on the surface of the blades. He'd need to translate them carefully. They're old. He picked them both up carefully, and thrust them equally carefully into his belt, before standing and looking around with Rocktooth in his left hand. Let's keep looking. There's supposed to be another place in here. Another room. It did not take long to find it. There was another passageway, a long and thin one that was again carved out of the living rock, and at the end was a door. There was dirt and rubbish piled against the bottom of it, but halfway up it was a lock, an ancient thing with a seal pressed from some kind of red wax that covered it. Tyrion stared at it in confusion. Surely wax would have eventually crumbled to pieces after all that time. That's the seal of the old kings in the north, Robb Stark muttered in a shocked voice. The Great Seal of Winter. Father's got it in a box somewhere in his solar. The last time it was used was after Torrhen Stark bent the knee to Aegon the Conqueror. He peered at it again. Yes, the seal was festooned with wolves. How very Starkish, if such a word existed. Why would a room in the Night Fort be sealed off with the symbol of the old kings in the north? Ser Alliser, can you shed any light on this? The sour-faced man shook his head, an expression of puzzled shock on his face. There's nothing in the histories that I've read about this place, he muttered, nor less about the Stark kings of old leaving their sign on the place. He walked up and peered at it closely, before tugging on the hasp. It seemed to be quite strong even after all these years. A good lock that. Odd. It's bloody ancient. Something tickled at the back of Tyrion's mind for an instant. I wonder, Tyrek Lannister told us to come with a Stark and mentioned that it should be the one that looked like a Tala. Robb Stark, would you mind inspecting the seal? The heir to Winterfell looked at him in bafflement. Why? Oh, just a feeling I have. Robb Stark looked at his friends, shrugged in bafflement, and then walked up to the lock. He inspected it carefully, and then reached out and tugged at the hasp, which snapped instantly like a rotten twig, before the entire thing crumbled like dust into his hands. They all stared at the debris in his hands. Good gods, someone said faintly, and after a moment, Tyrion realized that it had been him. Well now, I think that we were meant to open this door. They had to dig the debris clear from the floor in front of it to make room for Robb and Jon Stark to both pull the door open. It shrieked as it opened, and the noise set the hairs on the back of his neck on end in an instant. And as the door came open, a stench of decay reached them, one strong enough to make him pull a face. What in the name of all the gods is that? Theon Greyjoy gasped as he all but retched. Foul air, and more. Give it a moment to pass, Tyrion replied. Watch the torches carefully. If they start to gutter, then the air is too foul to breath. They waited a long moment, until the stench diminished a little. Only then did they enter. Beyond the door lay a large room. It was dominated by a huge chair, almost a throne, that stood with its back to the far wall. And there were bones everywhere, strewn all over the place. There were rusted knives on the floor amongst the bones. And in one corner, next to a pile of rubble, there was what might have been the remains of a cauldron. These are human, a horrified Sarah Lazarthorn muttered as he looked about. They're all human bones. Gods, what happened here? A massacre, Tyrion mused as he looked at Bones himself. No, the door was shut. Why seal the door? Are those marks on the bones from fighting? Nay, Mance Raider muttered as he lifted one blackened bone and peered at it. This looks as if it's been flended. Someone butchered this poor bugger. Why? Thepton Greyjoy asked, his face pale and wan. To eat him, boy, Thorne replied as he walked about the room and inspected the bones with distaste. This is the lair of a cannibal. The Greyjoy lad turned even paler, but did not throw up. It seemed to be a close-run thing, though. One of the bodies seemed to be more intact than the others, if barely. It was a huddle of bones in a tattered black robe, at the foot of the chair, or whatever it was. As he drew closer to the thing, Tyrion could see runes on the sides of it, and carvings as well. This is odd, Thorne muttered as he peered at the skull of the body in the cloak. There's finger bones threaded together with wire on this one's head. There was indeed. He peered at it, and then light dawned. A crown of bones. He was crowned with bones. How odd. He looked around again, and then made another connection. He might have been the one who cooked here. Could this be the Rat King? The others stared, and then there was a collective shrug. Might be, Jon Stark muttered. These bones have been here for centuries. It's an ancient legend, though. Yes, but one based on something at least. Tyrion replied as he looked about again. Someone killed men here, and then ate at least some of them. And there are many dark legends of this place. Perhaps this is the place that spawned the legends. Val reached down and lifted a large and very corroded axe. Wasn't there a tale of a man called Mad Axe? Aye, Thorne muttered. He was staring at the pile of debris in the corner. Is that a hole in the ceiling there? A number of the others walked over and looked up at it. I think it is. Yes, Robb Stark muttered. It heads upwards. We need a volunteer, Tyrion said brightly, only to get some very dirty looks sent his way. He sighed and thought very hard, calling up the memory of what he had seen so far of the Night Fort. Very well then. Can someone go back out of here, via the passageways we entered, and get to the kitchens? I think that we are currently under the northwest corner of the kitchens. Come on then, Giantsbane, Thorne said after a long moment. Let's be at it. The red-bearded man looked at the man of the Night's Watch as he walked away, and then looked back at Raider, who nodded. My life is getting odder by the minute, Tormund Giantsbane muttered, but followed the receding figure of the man in black. As they waited, Tyrion turned his attention to the throne, because that was what it most resembled, in front of them all. It was carved of granite, or something close to it, and the more he looked at it, the more he realized that this was ancient, even for the north. There were men, or the shapes of men, carved on one side, based on what light his brand was able to direct at it, and some kind of tree, and then an animal of some kind. The thing was filthy as well as ancient. But it was the runes that attracted his attention. They were of an ancient kind, proving how old the object was. He peered at them quizzically for long minutes, as the others wandered about and expressed disgust at what they found in places. Some of the runes he could read, others he could not. The one he definitely could read was the most obvious one. Stark. Two heads turned to him. What? Robb Stark muttered. Which of us do you need? No, he replied. That's what it says, at the top of this thing. It says Stark there. This is old. Very, very old. He went back to reading what he could of the runes, and the more he read, the more confused he became. Eventually, he looked about for an old sword and used it to scrape away at the base of the chair, where the tops of other runes could just about be seen. This, he panted, as he pulled the filthy debris away, is also odd. Why? Odd? Raider asked. He too was looking at the runes. Wait, I think I know what that part says. Throne of Winter? Nay, Jon Stark broke in. The Throne of Winter's at Winterfell. I know, I've seen it, Tyrion replied, but that's not as old as this is. I think that this might be the original Throne of Winter, or at least the first such object. But why seal it away? These runes are peculiar. They are older than anything I've ever seen. Some of the words are familiar and others are archaic. It was at this point that they heard a very odd noise in the far distance. It sounded like a mammoth being strangled in the far distance, or something like that, and everyone looked about wildly, until Robb Stark walked over to the hole in the ceiling and squinted up at it. After a moment there was a sound like stone scraping on stone, and eventually a faint light shone down from above, followed by a voice. Is that you, young wolf? Tormund? Aye, me and this stone-faced crow, as well as some of the others. We're in the kitchens, or under them at least. Storage room, underneath another storage room. There was a great stone slab over the hole, leading down here. Sealed off, probably. Might be that someone knew that something was wrong down there, and stuck that slab over it all. Took 5 of us to move it. Anything written on the slab? There was a moment of muttering, and then the voice of Seralus Thorn said, "Yes, not to move it on orders of the Lord Commander. I think that this is the place where so many dark legends of the Night Fort were born," Tyrion told the others before going back to the Throne of Winter. The others joined him. His scraping had revealed some new runes, and he read them carefully, in the language of the first men they read. "Stark had me made, on Leia Stark will I bade. If not a Stark ye shall fade." He read the words out loud for the others, who looked at him with confusion. "Fade," he mused. "That's an odd word to use. Why should someone fade? There's an old saying here in the north that when someone's gone a bit, well, odd that they've faded," Jon Stark said eventually. "Could it be linked to that?" "Odd as in mad, you mean?" He thought about it. And then terror sparked his mind as a number of connections appeared in his mind. "No one sit in that throne. No one." "What?" Raider asked, baffled. "Why not? The legends of the Night Fort, the people that have gone mad here, murdering and eating them. What if they found this place and then, on some whim, sat in that? The runes say that whatever it is, it will only obey a Stark, and that it will make anyone else fade. Go mad, in other words. It's been sealed off from the world for so long that other doors seems to have only yielded to the touch of a Stark. How many of the Night's Watch can read runes? How long has the throne been neglected so that the dirt of ages built up about it? For all we know, the Rat King, when he was just a cook, found this place and sat in that throne, and was sent mad. And the Night King, Mad Axe, how many others?" There was a sudden collective move away from the throne. Tyrion raised a placatory hand. "None of us have sat in it. I think that we are safe, but I have to transcribe those runes. Maester Aemon might have more light to shed on this. In the meantime, I think it best that the slab above us be replaced, and a new lock be made for the door. This is important. You Starks seem to have had some kind of a plan. Or to have set something up here. A long time ago, though. A long time ago." Hello, dear viewers. Support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it. And also, make sure you comment your thoughts. Now let's start the video.